One of my favourite bits of Shakespeare comes in The Merchant of Venice. Portia is a wealthy businesswoman, but her father has left some strange instructions in his will. She is only allowed to marry the man who chooses correctly from 3 caskets. The Prince of Morocco chooses the magnificent gold casket, inscribed with these words, "Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire." The Prince of Aragon chooses the nearly as fabulous silver one. "Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves." They both think that the prize must lie inside something so precious and ornate, and of course they think they're certain to win. They're worth it. But both are unsuccessful. Eventually, Bassanio, the one Portia really wants to marry anyway, comes along and he chooses the rather inauspicious-looking lead casket. This one reads, "Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath." He realises something of the nature of love and its invitation to embrace risk and vulnerability. This time he is successful. It may not have looked much from the outside, but inside was the picture of Portia and the permission he sought in order to marry her, the woman of his dreams. It's not an unusual trope in storytelling. If any of you remember the Indiana Jones film, The Last Crusade, you may recall that the villain is eager to get his hands on the Holy Grail, the cup Jesus allegedly used at the Last Supper, as he thinks it will make him immortal. He goes for the most ornate-looking chalice, but it's the wrong choice and he dies instantly. The correct choice is the plain wooden cup. I can't remember what happens then. I'm pretty certain that Indiana Jones doesn't end up being immortal. But the point I'm trying to make is this, that things are not always what they seem. I'm sure we all know that in many ways. Sometimes we think that something is going to transform our life, or that someone is full of good intentions towards us, and we might be disappointed and hurt to discover that things are not as they seemed. And it works the other way round too. Sometimes we make judgments and assumptions about people, and actually they prove us wrong, and we are pleasantly surprised and blessed. Things are not always as they seem. Actually, in the history of Israel that we read about in the Old Testament, it appears that things are pretty much never what they seem. It seems impossible that Israel could ever be released from the power of Egypt, and yet God transforms and liberates. It seems impossible that Jesse's youngest son David could be the one to rule over Israel. And on into the New Testament, it seems impossible that from the humble situation surrounding Jesus' birth could come salvation for the whole world. It seems impossible. Yet things are not always what they seem. With God, things are rarely what they seem. Our reading today shows us the gap that we might often think we perceive between what God has promised and what human beings are expecting. If we were to go back a few chapters in Genesis, we would find the beginning of the story of Abraham and Sarah, who are introduced to us at the end of chapter 11. And right at the beginning of their story is God's promise to them. "Go from your country," God says to them in chapter 12, verse 1. And immediately afterwards, in verse 2, God says, "I will make you a great nation." God is calling Abraham and Sarah to a new life. And in verse 3, we read that it's not just about them. "In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." We read that verse in the context of all that has gone before in Genesis. The sin and suffering, the murder of Abel, the hubris of the human race, the flood, Noah, Babel. And we realise that, yes, things really do need to change. Things seem pretty bad. And we might be tempted to think that there's no hope, that surely God cannot continue to put up with us and our selfish, unruly behaviour. But Abraham and Sarah mark the start of something different. They are going to be the agents of change. They will become a great nation, not in order to gain wealth and power and influence, but so that they can be a blessing. All this is back in the first few verses of chapter 12. And although chapter 15 doesn't seem that many pages away, actually quite a lot has happened and quite a lot of time has passed. Abraham and Sarah have travelled to Canaan. They've spent time in Egypt. There's been a quarrel with the extended family, which results in Abraham and Lot going their separate ways. after which Abraham is drawn into a violent conflict with some of the major principalities of southern Palestine. Their personal safety has often been under threat and is by no means certain. But perhaps in the light of God's promise at the start of chapter 12, the most threatening thing is the fact that they don't have any children. How can this family, which seems to be facing all the perils of life at a dangerous time, become a great nation? How can this family be a blessing to others when it doesn't look as though it's going to last even into the next generation? It's no surprise then that when the swords are laid down at the end of chapter 14 and God renews the promise, Abraham questions this. He wants to know what God is going to do. He asks God, "What will you give me, seeing as we don't have any children?" God responds by making a covenant, and in this act, God pledges on God's honour to fulfil the promise that was made. The ritual which follows seems strange to us, but was probably a more familiar way of sealing an agreement to those in the ancient world, although I'm sure that the sight of a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passing through the pieces of the slaughtered animals during the night would have been a surprising, terrifying sight. God pledges God's very self to Abraham as a way of giving Abraham renewed confidence in the promise. But actually, even before the ritual takes place, Abraham declares his trust in God. And God also affirms that, come what may, there will always be a right relationship, righteousness, between them. When Abraham asks the question, it seems to him that the promised future, in which he becomes the ancestor of thousands, might only be a pipe dream. He's probably wondering if he's been scammed. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is, he might be thinking. As days and months and years pass, the idea of parenthood seems to slip further away from Abraham and Sarah. Surely this is never going to happen. But it's not what it looks like. Things are not what they seem. With God, the impossible becomes possible, and seemingly far-fetched and extravagant promises really do come true. In the end, God will bless Abraham and Sarah with a son, although they'll have to wait until chapter 21 for that. Before that happens, Abraham and Sarah face other adventures that might often seem to threaten God's promise. Their faith wavers and wobbles. They try and take matters into their own hands. But as we read the story, we know that God's commitment to them, God's promise, is as strong as ever. And as we read, so perhaps we also come to understand better that the distance between what God has promised and the realities we human beings experience often lies more in our perception than in actual fact. What do things seem like to you at the moment? When we look at the world around us, things seem pretty bad. We might be wondering what hope there is for the planet. Environmental destruction was bad enough, but now war is raging too, and we're fearful of how this will end. We might wonder what hope there is. We think about the promise that God will never leave us or forsake us. We remember the promise that in all things God works for the good of those who love God, and perhaps we find ourselves, like Abraham and Sarah, wobbling a little bit. Perhaps it feels as though God has left us. Perhaps we're doubting what kind of good might be able to come. Perhaps we're crying out to God, asking questions, demanding to know what God is doing. If things are as they seem, then we're all in a hopeless mess. The Bible shows us that the God of love and mercy and grace will have the last word in our affairs. This doesn't mean that we'll be wrapped up in cotton wool and cocooned from the difficulties and dangers of life, as we can see in the story of Abraham and Sarah. Our challenge, just like Sarah and Abraham, is to believe and trust that this will be so, that God will remain faithful even when it seems impossible, and even when it looks as though it can't possibly be true. With God, things are never as they seem. What seemed like defeat at the cross ultimately proved to be victory. What seems like wisdom to the world is foolishness to God, and vice versa. My richest gain I count but loss. Things are not as they seem. And God has pledged God's very self to us in Jesus. God will not leave us. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. God is ever loving, ever merciful, ever faithful. Of course, this is not a license to sit back and do nothing. Actually, there are so many times in which God's promises are enacted and made real to others through us. When we show love and care to others, when we give to those in need, when we are peacemakers, when we care for all of creation, when we forgive, we are making the promises of God real in the world around us. God chooses us to participate in God's loving purposes for the whole world through us. Through our love, through our action for love and justice, the love and faithfulness of God is realised in the world. Through the words and deeds of others, we often come to be reminded of the love and faithfulness of God to us. Things are never as they seem. In Jesus, there is always hope of transformation. Things are never as they seem. Hallelujah. Things are never as they seem. God has for each one of us plans and purposes, a hope and a future. Today may we grasp hold of God's promises of love and faithfulness, and may God work through us to bring blessing to the world. Amen.